interplays with the indemnity. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll do a bit of a deep dive into the indemnity and the limitation of liability. So if you can get an indemnity from the supplier, the first thing that you would want to look at is, what does that indemnity cover? Generally, when an indemnity comes to you and it's been drafted by the supplier, they're obviously going to draft it in as limited way as possible. So they may well limit it to direct losses only. Whereas you, as the package organizer, you're going to want the indemnity to cover all losses. And that would include things like loss of profits, expenses and costs. And that's particularly important when you're looking at it from a PTD risk perspective, because those are losses that you may well suffer if you're having to compensate the customer, or if you're having to offer a price reduction to the customer, or if you're having to find alternative arrangements at short notice at a higher price because of a supplier breach. So you will want to carve those particular losses out of any exclusion that there may well be in the contract. The indemnity might also be limited to specific events, so it may well only cover third-party claims, for example, as opposed to more general liability. And if that's the case, again, that might not be sufficient for your purposes. So you know, you would likely, in a scenario where there has been a breach by your supplier, you would likely deal with it there and then. You would look to offer price reduction, you would potentially look to offer alternative arrangements, and you'll deal with it far earlier than any claim being issued. So if the indemnity that's being given by the supplier is, you know, the trigger event is that a claim has to be issued, well, that's not going to be sufficient. So you would want to look at that trigger event and make sure that it actually applies much earlier and actually just applies in relation to a non-provision or an improper provision of the service by the supplier. You'll also want to look at how the indemnity links in conjunction with the limitation of liability clause. So indirect or consequential losses tend to be excluded as standard in most limitation of liability clauses. And that, as I mentioned earlier, can really catch you out when you have the PTD liability. So you will really want to look at what indirect or consequential losses mean and whether you actually need some carve out of that particular clause to cover your PTD risk. You'll also want to look at whether there's a cap on liability, and if there is a cap on liability, is the indemnity subject to it, or is the indemnity excluded from it? The cap also tends to be linked to a number of things, but generally you would tend to see a cap linked to things like the charges being paid under the agreement, so either the charges paid